So grade Trump on China so far. How's he doing? What do you think?
This is your questions I really hate answering.
Why? Because you don't grade people?
Well, I'm basically a social democrat, and we're gentle, and we have...
So you grade on a curve?
No. We basically have a seminar and talk to your parents.
China. No matter how you or the president pronounces it, there's no denying the impact that this rising power is having on the rest of the world. But is China a superpower? And if not, how long until it becomes one? How did a communist country become such an industrial powerhouse, and how will it shape the world in the decade to come? Buckle up. We're talking China all episode long. Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to your GZERO world, coming at you from an island in the Atlantic, also known as Nantucket. I'm on vacation, but the show must go on. I sit down with Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia. Then I'll take your questions in a special China edition of Office Hours. And on Puppet Regime, Vladimir Putin does not talk about China. But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. Let's talk about China, fast becoming the force for change outside of their borders as much as from within. What's China getting right? What are they getting wrong? And what important questions do we still not know the answers to? If we can unpack some of that, we can learn a great deal about where China and the rest of the world is heading in the decade to come. So first, what's China doing right? Have to start with political stability. For decades now, there's been a presumption across the West that as China becomes wealthier, they will need to politically reform or they will fail. Turns out that's wrong. China today is a successful middle-income country of 1.4 billion people, and yet there's been no political reform to speak of. Top-down authoritarianism. The average Chinese believes in the China dream, and they believe in it because of, not in spite of, the Chinese government. Number two, the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese government actually has a global strategy. Launched in 2013, they've spent almost $1 trillion so far on projects all over the world, building infrastructure that aligns those countries with the Chinese who are writing the checks. If things don't work out, their debt has to be paid to China. Their influence politically coming from Beijing. That's an enormous advantage for China globally that previously was mostly the United States. And number three, technology. 10 years ago, China was considered, at best, a country that could only develop technology by stealing it from other countries. Today, they've invested enormous amounts. Not only is the private sector building, but the government is supporting those critical technology companies as the most important Chinese strategy. And as a consequence, in 2018, China is not only successful technologically, but they are, along with the United States, a technology superpower, an enormous advantage for China as we think about the future. What's China getting wrong? First, debt. Massive amounts of sovereign and, even more importantly, corporate debt. The Chinese economy is driven by state-owned enterprises, these huge, lumbering, incredibly inefficient organizations that are piling and piling on debt while the Chinese government refuses to bankrupt them. It's helpful in that you can continue to employ lots of inefficient labor. It's problematic in that eventually you have to pay these bills or the economy starts to really slow. At some point, the potential for a harder landing of the Chinese economy becomes a bigger and bigger risk. Number two, the Chinese government owns all the downside. When you're responsible for how the economy does as the public sector, when things go wrong, it's all your fault. In the United States, if there's an environmental problem, we usually blame the company that's doing the chemical dumping. In the Chinese case, whether it's lack of arability of land, or it's problematic water supply, or you can't breathe the air, you're not blaming the private sector, you're blaming the Chinese government. That's true on cyber, too. If someone attacks a United States corporation and your data suddenly goes missing or stolen, you're going to blame that company. Equifax, Yahoo. In China, you blame the Chinese government. These risks are increasingly on Beijing and their leadership and not on the private sector. And the third thing China's getting wrong is international trade. As much as Xi Jinping, the president, wants to stand up and say, we're in favor of free trade, what China really wants is just a quiet global environment so they can continue to work on trying to become the world's next superpower. President Trump is saying no mas, or the China equivalent, as he's slapping tariffs on China, also restricting technology investments and buys, and generally making life harder for the Chinese. The Chinese assumed that at least the Europeans would be supportive of them and not wanting to see a Trump-led trade war. The Europeans are also tightening their trade relations with the Chinese. Everyone seems to have a problem with Beijing on trade right now among the advanced industrial economies. That's a big emerging risk that the Chinese president wants absolutely no part of. China's President Xi Jinping remains the wild card. On the one hand, an extraordinary anti-corruption campaign over the 5 years of his first term has spread across the entirety of China's economic and political class. Secondly, virtually all of Xi Jinping's key supporters in politics are now in positions of critical authority. And if Xi Jinping wants to be president for life, he's managed to toss out term limits. He can stay in power, or at least has a pathway, for a very long time. But does that mean China will be successful under Xi? Will their institutions flourish as his personal ambitions do? And what does that mean for China's relations with its own people and with other countries around the world? Questions remain. Can China undo or live with the damage that development has inflicted under a supreme President Xi? Can this rising power build constructive non-zero-sum relations with the established power, the United States and its allies? And of course, can Xi maintain the enormous degree of control that he's amassed? The answers to those questions will have greater impact than any other for the next 10 years of our geopolitical history. That's enough for me. Now, it's to you for Office Hours, where I take questions from you via social media.
Given that China is as strong as ever and is growing stronger very rapidly, and the United States is abdicating a lot of influence in the region thanks to the America First policies, how do you think that's going to influence the future of Taiwan? Is that going to change the status quo at all?
First of all, Tim, you automatically win best location for an Office Hours question, especially one on China. And yes, I do think it changes the status quo for Taiwan, but it's not mostly about America first. I mean, I remember when President Trump, right after he won that election, he took that congratulatory phone call from the Taiwanese president. Everyone watching Taiwan was like, oh my God, he's changing the one China policy, can't question that. But the reality is the reason that Taiwan's status quo is changing is because China's becoming a lot more powerful. They don't need Taiwan as a manufacturing hub anymore, as a technology hub anymore. They're kind of marginal. It's a political irritant for the mainland, and they're much more willing to squeeze the Taiwanese government, especially a Taiwanese government that's actually governed by the nationalists. They're also much more willing to build up their military and flex their muscles vis-a-vis the United States. How credible would it be that the Americans are going to be able to actually defend Taiwan when China becomes the world's largest economy and has a clearly dominant military in their backyard in 5 and 10 years' time? Whether or not you ever had America First, whether or not you ever had President Trump, that's what's really relevant for the future of Taiwan.
My question for you is about the U.S.-China trade war. It seems like both countries are really determined to win and things are getting hot. Where do you see this going?
I don't think that the Americans and the Chinese are both looking for a trade war, Tyler. First of all, the American economy is a lot larger. This is going to hurt China more than the United States. And so as a consequence, China really doesn't want to see escalation. And President Trump himself would love to show a deal and show that he's the guy that was tough with the Chinese but got a deal together. Think about how he's handled North Korea. Think about even the willingness to talk to the Iranians. The point is that neither side feels like they can afford to look weak right now. In the case of Trump, that more pressure with the midterm elections coming up, more pressure with the Mueller investigations coming up. In the case of Xi Jinping, if the Americans are escalating, you can't just sit and do nothing, as the Japanese have done, for example, as the Europeans just have. So the dangers around the United States and China are absolutely greater. At the same time, I would be surprised if this really blossoms into a full-on trade war between the world's two largest economies in the coming year. That's it for this week. Remember that if you want your question answered, all you have to do is email a short video to submissions@gzeromedia.com. This week, I sit down with Kevin Rudd. He's president of the Asia Society's Policy Institute and the former Prime Minister of Australia, or as we like to call him, the Thunder from Down Under. Today, we'll go deep on all things China. We'll chart its remarkable rise under Xi Jinping and look ahead to what awaits the country and the world it will shape in the decade to come. Let's get to it.
Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, great to be with you.
Dr. Bremer.
Yes, indeed.
How's life?
Life is good,
Good.
but China's interesting these days. I keep hearing that Xi Jinping is under a little more domestic pressure. How seriously should I take that?
Well, the interesting thing is that there's been a commentary published online
By this professor?
by Professor Xu, ex-Xu, Professor of Law at Tsinghua University, which is a very direct, in-your-face criticism of Xi Jinping personally and an in-your-face criticism of the current conduct of the Chinese Communist Party. So what has got all of us scratching our heads who watch these things professionally is how come it's stayed up now for more than a week? And
Usually that would be not shared.
yeah, very rapidly these dissenting opinion pieces online would be vaporized in one form or another. But it's also in the week when the leadership retreats to the beach, Beidaihe, a place I've been to over the years, not to be recommended as a normal beach resort, but they've been doing it since the 50s. That's where the entire leadership go to chew the fat on what's happening for the year ahead in Chinese politics. So this occurs on the eve of that. So to your question, how much pressure is Xi under? I think some is the answer, and it's certainly a more complex political environment for him than it was 3 months ago.
If you were like kind of looking at all of the constellation of difficulties that Xi Jinping is presently facing that would lead to this kind of a backlash, how would you rank them? What would you tell people to say, here's what I'd really be paying attention to?
In terms of the pressures, I put them into 3 boxes. Number 1, the trade-related box. There's a criticism of the administration in Beijing that they didn't get their analysis of how serious Trump was right. But secondly, they also thought Europe would stay on their side and not rejoin the American side. The Juncker visit to Washington, I think, caught them by surprise.
The EU Commission President.
That's right, Mr. Juncker. That was a big development in, frankly, upsetting the apple cart from Beijing's perspective. Then there's a second box, which is, have you, Xi Jinping, gone too far out there in provoking the United States and the collective West more generally? In other words, have you been poking the bear too much? The bear here being the United States. And so, historically, Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin adhered to a different strategy, which was hide your strength, bide your time. In other words, let's not talk about what we might be thinking of doing in the world until we've got all our ducks in a row. Whereas Xi Jinping, as of about 4 years ago, abandoned that strategy. So there is a debate about that, which is bringing pressure to bear. And the final box is a lot of chatter in the Chinese Twitterverse equivalent on Weibo and elsewhere, comes and goes, disappears quickly, about the cult of personality. That is the critique that there is too much of Xi Jinping as the dominant leader in Chinese politics, more so than at any time since Mao.
So grade Trump on China so far. How's he doing? What do you think?
This is your questions I really hate answering.
Why? Because you don't grade people?
Well, I'm basically a social democrat, and we're gentle, and we have...
So you grade on a curve?
No. We basically have a seminar and talk to your parents and say that you should improve or that you've been misbehaving slightly. I've got to say on the economy stuff, Trump has achieved what none of his predecessors have, which is to focus China's attention on the long-term unacceptability of Chinese mercantilist practices.
And you sound a little surprised by that.
Of course I am, because the general critique of your president is that he's a bit of a klutz. Well, he might be a bit of a klutz, but on this question of demonstrating to the Chinese that he's not just got a loud mouth talking about stuff on China like during the campaign, but he's actually done stuff. So I give him marks for that. Where I don't yet give him any marks is the lack of coherence as to what the exit strategy is from a trade war once you've declared it and operationalised it. And there's complications there. Chinese face. Do you look at the possibility that this ends, in China's case, with them saying, we don't have any cards left to play. I, Xi Jinping, am in some degree of difficulty personally. Trump ain't going to back down, so I therefore will pull the nationalist card more comprehensively. And where does that then take the entire US-China relationship, including on security questions? That's one scenario we should think through. So tick to Trump in terms of causing the leadership to focus, as they will be for an entire month down by the beach at Beidaihe. Second, though, in terms of what's the landing point, not sure. On the security relationship, I think Chinese policy has not yet been challenged in the South China Sea by the United States to any significant extent. It remains to be seen whether there'll be any change on that score. Where Trump, I think, in the China relationship has given China a lot of encouragement has been the periodic outbreak of frustration on his part toward American allies generally in Asia and in Europe.
So if you had to pick Trump or Obama in terms of preferable policy towards China so far, you'd say?
I'd say they dealt in different times and different periods of the China relationship.
That's terribly diplomatic. No, it sounds like you're saying kind of Trump is surprisingly to you doing a better job on China.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that on the economic relationship, his reaction has been so in your face that it's caused an internal debate to emerge in China whether they have gone too far. That's useful. What Obama succeeded in doing, which Trump has failed abysmally on, is getting the Chinese to place one foot on the sticky paper, perhaps an Australian expression, on climate change and get them to Paris and get them to agree to the Paris Accord.
Is the sticky paper where large or like spiders get stuck so they don't bite you in the house? Is that what it is?
Yeah, a bit like that. You have these bits of sticky stuff around so that the really big challenges for those who suffer from arachnophobia like you get stuck. But in Australia we have such big spiders and they're hairy and they basically can tackle you.
Yeah.
And then take your carotid artery out. And
so hence you need that. And Obama had one of those for China.
Yeah.
Trump does not have a sticky
He got the Chinese onto that sticky paper on climate.
Yeah.
Okay. And climate, given that China is the world's largest emitter, is important for all of us. So tick to the Obama administration on that one.
Where might we be surprised? Where are the big opportunities where suddenly there's going to be a flip, there's going to be a change? The New York Times head story that hasn't been written yet where you say, wow, I had no idea the Chinese would do that.
Well, the one that's always caused me to think in terms of an American reaction will be when China reaches a tipping point in its net economic influence in Central America and the Caribbean. In other words, on your doorstep. Historically, as far as America's other neighbours, the pesky Canadians to your north and the Mexicans to your south, neither of those have had particularly close relationships with China. But where does that fit within Chinese grand strategy? Well, if you Americans are going to give us a whole lot of trouble on our doorstep by continuing to be the power metropolitan in Asia, in countries which border the People's Republic of China, then we won't be nearly as provocative in terms of being militarily upfront, directed in your face. But don't be surprised if we become the indispensable economic power of every single country within the Caribbean and Central America while you guys are not watching, including Mexico.
How far do you think the Chinese government presently thinks in terms of a global role? how much of the world they want to be able to determine?
Well, those are two different questions. I mean, I think if you look carefully at what Xi Jinping has said most recently at the Foreign Policy Work Conference of the party only a couple of months ago in Beijing, the very significant change in Chinese language is this. 5 or 6 years ago, China was going to participate in the reform of the global system. Chinese word is 参加. Then a few years on, China would help guide the reform of the global system. 引导 is the Chinese verb. 2 months ago, it became China will lead the reform of the global system. 领导. This is a very significant linguistic transformation, given that China speaks through these sorts of formulations as a one-party state. On the more hard-edged geopolitical point, which is the core of your question, China's mission is to have a role in wider East Asia where they are capable of singularly influencing events in the direction compatible with China's core national interests, because they see this as their natural strategic hemisphere.
So the Americans must leave at some point.
It's been quite plain from Chinese declaratory policy for decades that they want to see the end of US alliances. They don't see a future for the United States in the region in a geostrategic sense. As for the rest of the world, I think the Chinese template is not that. The Chinese template is to be the indispensable economic partner of the rest of the world, so that when matters arise in other regions of the world or other global councils, there's always this economic lever to pull and saying, hey, by the way, you do know that we're pretty important to you. You wouldn't want to make life too difficult for us. So I think it's kind of at those 3 levels: the immediate 14 neighbouring states and wider East Asia, where China has a definitive view that it doesn't wish to be messed with in terms of its core interests, and therefore will apply maximum over time geostrategic leverage. To the other continents, Europe, the Latin Americas of the world, North America, Africa, the Middle East, they wish to be the indispensable partner, so that when the issue arises, if it does, then you pull in the favour. And then there's the global order reform questions, the rules of the system, where they're active.
So despite all of the challenges that Xi Jinping is experiencing, headwinds today inside China, as a country, are you more confident about China today than you were a couple of years ago? About the same?
Confident of China...
Capacity going forward.
Of China actually succeeding in becoming the next superpower?
Yeah.
No, my view hasn't changed. It's a qualified view. And the reason for it is because of the political economy of the country. They've still not bitten the bullet on the next stage of economic reform. They're not implementing the next stage of market-based reforms effectively, so that will affect productivity growth over time and conceivably economic growth as well. And the reason they have gone slow on that is because of the politics of political economy, which is I, Xi Jinping, still want to be able to control industry policy through state-owned enterprises which act independently of markets. So I think the big strategic problem China faces in realising its dream, apart from the usual list of environmental constraints and some civil unrest and the rigidity of a one-party state, is the core question of having thus far, 6 years into his administration, gone really slow on the reform blueprint that was laid out for them in 2013.
Kevin Rudd, thank you very much.
Good to be with you, Dr. Bremer.
And now I've got your puppet regime, where Russian President Vladimir Putin turns to the group to help him throw out his summer look and become the Vlad he was always meant to be.
Okay, guys, are you ready?
The original 3 terms, he was fighting for legitimacy. Now, he's fighting forever.
I am trying to get a little bit out of comfort zone.
I want him to look at his diet and imagine a different kind of life.
Yeah, balance. Yeah, symmetry. You got this. I know you've got this. I see the man he is
And the man he was born to be.
They will show me how good my life can be if I just care.
Democrat or autocrat, common thread that holds all humans together? We just want to be loved.
It's saying, I love you.
I want Russia to be excited about new me. Okay, guys, here I go.
You just look more like yourself.
Yes, new me is even more like me than old me. See you in 2024, bitches.
If you like what you've seen, check us out at GZEROmedia.com. See you next week.